Hello and welcome back to session 5 of Decolonising the Body, the 2021 Decolonial Summer School programme. So this week the topic is race, and what I want to do in this short recording is give you an introduction to the concept of Orientalism as it emerges in the work of the Palestinian-American intellectual Edward Said. So Edward Said is quite often credited with being one of the founders of postcolonial studies, and that's often traced back to this particular book that he wrote in 1978 called Orientalism. Said was a keen reader of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Now, we've spoken about Foucault a bit in previous weeks. Just to recap, Foucault was very interested in trying to think about how power operates in modern societies. And his argument was that we need to stop thinking about power as just something that is operating from top down, being imposed on us, but rather in modern societies, we need to think about how power circulates horizontally, how all of us are part of the processes of producing and reproducing power. He talks about the various social institutions that are established in the modern era: schools, hospitals, mental asylums, prisons, and how these institutions create certain norms around what is a healthy person, what is a sane person, what is a good person, a productive person. And Foucault is interested in how we then, as modern subjects, take on these norms and use them to regulate and discipline ourselves and each other. So we spoke about this quite a lot in previous weeks when we were talking about gender and the ways in which gender norms are produced and reproduced in society. What Said was interested in was to think through how these norms also are used to provide a justification for hierarchies between different cultural groups, different ethnicities, different races. And in particular, he picks up on one aspect of Foucault's work, and that is the idea of discourse. So what does discourse mean? So discourse has a technical meaning. It's been used in the study of linguistics to just refer to a statement. But for Foucault, discourse meant more than just a statement. For Foucault, a statement about something, the production of knowledge or a representation of something, was always a process of power, both a reflection of existing power, but the reproduction of power. And Said was very interested in this idea and took this to thinking about how knowledge that was produced in the colonial period about different parts of the world by Europe, how that knowledge was both invested in power, so invested in the processes of domination that allowed for that encounter, so colonial power, but also how those statements and representations about other people was also used to reinforce the superiority of the West. So for Said, there's two things I think that are really crucial that we should sort of continue to think about in relation to understanding why racism and why ideas of race still circulate so much in the modern world, even though, as I said, the sciences that tried to establish, biological facts of racial difference from the late 19th century and early 20th century have been proven to be scientifically inaccurate. For Said, these representations, racialized representations of others, do two important things. One, they help the West identify what it is to be the West, what it means to be a Western subject, by being able to contrast the Western subject with the colonized other. So we might think about, and this is the examples that Said uses in Orientalism, about the ways in which during the colonial period, through anthropology, through the racial sciences, through art, literature, through travel writing, all sorts of bodies of knowledge were produced about others, and particularly colonized peoples, and that those presentations of others often depicted them as less rational, more prone to emotion, potentially more violent, sexually perverted. how these representations in turn help to shore up an idea of the Western subject, which, as I spoke about in earlier weeks, the ideal was that there was this Western subject who was rational and in control of themselves, and therefore was worthy of making decisions, of ruling, of producing legitimate knowledge. So Said shows that whether it's in the paintings that we still see in art galleries, whether it's in novels that are written from that period, whether in some of the anthropological studies that are done about different people, that this in the colonial period was an important part of justifying why the West was more civilized than other parts of the world. But for Said, these representations not only provided a justification for Western domination during the colonial period, but they also continue to circulate in the post-colonial world. So even after the end of formal colonization, for Said, these representations that circulate in society continue to reinforce an idea of Western civilization and superiority over other parts of the world. I mean, for many of us, this argument became really relevant when we were looking at what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 and the establishment of the war on terror. Because actually many of the stereotypes that Said identified from the colonial period about Arabs, for example, or Muslims, we saw once again circulating within media, within advertising, within political discourse. And so for Said, it's really important for us to recognize that these representations have become so much a part of our world, the imagery is so much a part of our world, that quite often they're unconsciously reproduced. And that, more than any sort of scientific foundation of racial difference, explains why it is that racism continues to circulate within the world. Another important aspect of this, which I think we should take up, is that these representations, these colonial Orientalist representations, are not just ways in which the West saw other parts of the world, but because they have circulated so much and been reproduced so often, they have also often shaped our own, so us as colonized or racialized people, our own understandings and representations of ourselves. And so I suppose the important point to take from that is, how can we think about the ways in which a cartoon, say, of Chinese people, or a joke about Africans, how these images are not just the production of, someone's mind sitting in 2021, but how often they draw on ideas and stereotypes and imagery that have a much longer history. And that history dates back to colonization. And without addressing that history, we're actually not really any closer to being decolonized.